to the final study in this series after the flood, and we find ourselves again having to paint the big picture. We've been painting some big canvases, haven't we, in the course of this study, and it's no different here this morning, because we have Yahweh making a promise to Abram, calling him out of Ur the Chaldees around about 250 years after the great rebellion of Nimrod. So it's approximately 250 years that God waits before he starts the process of unwinding Nimrod's apostasy. And of course he begins with this one man who was a Shemite, which indicates to us that, of course, the line of Shem had been seriously affected by the apostasy of Nimrod. Nimrod, of course, was from Ham, but that apostasy had crept into what you might call the brotherhood of the time. Began with Noah, of course, down through Shem, through this line. But they had become corrupted. They had been turned away to false gods. And so the apostasy had been at work now for 250 years, when God steps in and says, enough. He's going to start the process of unwinding Nimrod's rebellion, which is going to take him, of course, to the end of 7,000 years of human history, as we saw yesterday. Now, we saw this chart and we saw the interesting facts concerning it, that Eber overlived Abraham by 4 years. And it's interesting when you look at verse 16 of Genesis chapter 11, it says this: and Eber lived 34 years, so he's 34 years of age, and he begat Peleg. So Eber, the Hebrew, was only 34 when they were scattered, because his son Peleg was born, and he was named Divided, because that was the era in which God divided the nations. He confused their tongues, as we found in verse 8. All right, so here is a man, only 34 years of age, who has to make a critical decision in life. Now, 34 in those days, of course, was like a pup, because they lived for 400, 500 years. So to be 34 is like being a 10-year-old in our terms. But of course, he was obviously a responsible man, and he refused to be involved in the building of the Tower of Babel. And for that, God preserved in him the Hebrew language. Now, there must have been in him, of course, obviously, faithfulness. Where did it go? Well, it disappeared in this particular family, somewhere down in here. Apostasy had crept in and had corrupted that family. And so God starts by calling Abram from that family to begin the process of unwinding Nimrod's work. Shem, of course, was already still there. He was there long after the death of Abraham. And he was the priest of the Most High God, preserving the truth in Salem. And it was to there, of course, that Abraham was to ultimately come. Now, here's Abram's nativity, as was read out for us this morning. Here is the birth of Eber, the Hebrew, dies 4 years after Abraham, and Abram is born 225 years after Eber. And we look down these names. Peleg, division, that's when the division occurred in Genesis 11 verse 8. Ru, friend. Serug, branch. Perhaps the problem was somewhere in here. Nahor, the snorer, who went to sleep. We don't know what happened, but something serious happened in this family. And when we get down to Terah, we know that Terah was an idolater. We know that from Joshua chapter 24, verses 1 and 2. Your fathers dwelt on the other side of the flood, and there they served other gods, Joshua told Israel, as he reminded them of their history. And of course, Terah has 3 sons, one of whom dies in Ur the Chaldees before Terah his father, Abram and Nahor. And of course, Lot is Haran's son, so there's a member of that particular family when they come to Haran. And that's, of course, where we were when we got to verse 31, 32 of chapter 11. But Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his son's son, and their wives, and they went forth with them from Ur the Chaldees to go to the land of Canaan, and they came unto Haran and dwelt there. Now, why did Terah choose Haran, do you think? We want to explore that. There was a reason why he went to Haran. Now, they didn't know where they were going. Paul tells us this in Hebrews chapter 11. When they left Ur the Chaldees, they had no idea where this land was that had been promised to Abram. At least at that point, there was no idea. So they had free choice. So they made their way up the Euphrates. A fairly obvious thing to do, isn't it? To stay near the river. But why was Terah going in that direction? Well, we'll find out. Now this is Mesopotamia. That word means the highland of the two rivers. The two rivers, of course, are Euphrates and the Tigris. Tigris goes up right up into here. So this area in here was called, not that it was very high land, but it was called the highland of the two rivers. And that term occurs 7 times in Scripture. Interesting, isn't it? That Mesopotamia should occur 7 times, because this is all about the beginning of the work of calling out Abram from apostasy to make to him covenants of promise. And there are 7 promises made to Abraham, as we're going to see a little later on. Now, was its port, the port of Mesopotamia. And those of you who've got good eyes can see this dotted line here. See that? That's where the Persian Gulf used to be in the time of Abraham. It has been silted up, of course, as the waters flow down these rivers. It's silted up the head of the Persian Gulf, and today, of course, it's down here. It's all swampland down there, by the way. But here was of the Chaldees. It was only a short step from the Persian Gulf, and so it was a major trading port in its day. And it looked like this. Here's the Euphrates. The boats would come up here. They could come into the West Harbour. They could come up here. They could go to the North Harbour. So it was a very, very important trading centre. And Abram and Sarah, Terah, his father and their family lived somewhere in this city of of the Chaldees. Now you'll notice the dark colours on this illustration. These here, that one there, that one there. They are all temples to false gods. This is the temple of Enki. Down here, over here, we have the ziggurat, which we'll see in a moment. We have the sanctuary of Inanna, we'll talk about him. We've got the temple of Enunmark. There were all sorts of gods here in the Chaldees. And here is today. It was, of course, this place had a ziggurat made of mud bricks, and the whole city was built of mud bricks held together by bitumen called slime in Genesis chapter 11 verse 3. And it's a reasonably well preserved place, as you can see. Back in the 1950s and 60s, you can obviously see that from the vehicles that are here. They used to take tourist parties there. Now the last great restoration of was by Nabonidus between 556 and 539 BC. He was the father of Belshazzar. And he appointed his eldest daughter as high priestess at So he was very much into women taking a prominent part in religious life. The Chaldees signifies the light of the conquerors, and yet it was a place of darkness and death. So that's a very great misnomer, as we're going to see. It was the largest city of Shinar, commercial and political hub of that region. Originally, of course, as we said, the port of Babylonia. It was a centre of ancient astrology and the home of the moon god Nana. In the Babylonian, it was called Sin, S-I-N. Now, the other centre of the worship of Nana, or Sin, was Haran. There were 2 major centres of the worship of the moon god. of the Chaldees and Haran. So you're beginning to see perhaps why it was that Terah, who, having been told by Abram that God had appeared to him and made this promise, said, okay, son, well, I can't deny that, some gods appeared to you. We'll go somewhere else. So they go up the Euphrates, and he goes to the second most important centre of the worship of the same gods that he'd been serving in the Chaldees. And of course, that's typical of human nature, isn't it? That's exactly how humans behave. The truth has not yet settled into Terah's mind and probably never truly does. Now this place, the Chaldees, had a temple sacred to the moon goddess Urki as well. It was also a burial city full of tombs, and the dead were brought to from all over Mesopotamia. It's a little bit like the Mount of Olives today, They all want to be buried in the Mount of Olives. And there are literally thousands of tombs there. So it was with the Chaldees. Now who are these Chaldees? Well, the Hebrew word is kasdimah. It means clod breakers, which means that they had some kind of agricultural base. The Kasdim, the Kadi and the Kurds, or Chaldees, are generally supposed to be Shemites. Now you can go to eastern Turkey and northern Iraq today and encounter many hundreds of thousands of Kurds. You've heard about them? Kurds? Yeah. They're the descendants of the Chaldeans. They're still there today, thousands of years after Abraham was called from this place. And they had gods many and lords many. Now you notice down, this is a pretty well preserved ziggurat, isn't it? You notice down here this dark colour at the bottom? They actually glazed those bricks and they had various colours up the wall. The reason for that was that this was different levels of gods. It was in recognition of various gods. The ones who were down at the bottom, of course, were the lower order of gods, and as you moved up, you were a higher order. A bit like the Greeks, isn't it? They had gods many and lords many. They had demigods, and then they had gods above them and gods above them. Gradations of power. Now, Ur was a city of death. Between 1922 and 34, the royal cemetery at Ur, which goes right back to 2600 BC, which is around the time of Abraham, was discovered. It revealed the death of the king and queen of Ur that was followed by a mass slaughter, a voluntary death of their courtiers and personal attendants and of the court soldiers and musicians. So if you worked for the king and the queen in those days and they kicked the bucket, then that was the end for you as well. You too were placed in their tomb, a bit like the Egyptians did, remember? They would take the servants and the courtiers and the important people that were associated with the king, and they would be killed and buried with them. They needed servants in the afterlife. That was their thinking. So Ur is a city of death. It was noted for its idolatry, which of course can only lead to death, and all its rulers and the house perished with them. So when they buried the king and queen, everybody else that was associated with them went into death. Whereas of course what God was doing in calling Abram out of this place was leading him to life. And that requires faith in God. It will bring eternal life. And all in Abraham will be redeemed in his seed. So you see the contrast that's being shaped here. And we get some idea as to why God called Abram from this particular place. Now here is a model of the ziggurat at Ur. It was devoted to the moon god Nana, that's the Sumerian name, or Sin in the Babylonian. Now the moon we know is a symbol for an ecclesiastical system. It's used of the ecclesia in places like Psalm 89 verse 37. Now this was a very false ecclesiastical system because here Abraham and his family served other gods. We're told that in Joshua chapter 24 and verse 2. So Abram and Sarai and their family were very familiar with the worship that went on here. They may well have climbed these steps up the ziggurat as well. We don't know. But what we do know is that they were up to their ears in it. And God starts the process of extracting them from it. Get thee out of thy country. So when we came to chapter 12, verse 1, we read this. Now Yahweh had said. Now had said implies, of course, that God had spoken, clearly spoken to Abram in Ur the Chaldees. And he was to repeat that promise the second time at Haran. So Abram was 70 years of age when God called him out of Ur the Chaldees. He was 75 years of age when God repeated the promise, and he left Haran and crossed the Euphrates and came into the land of Canaan. So they made their way up from Ur, way down here at the head of the Persian Gulf, to Haran. Now Haran doesn't happen to be on the river Euphrates. It's some 40 or 50 miles away from the Euphrates. It's out in the middle of nowhere. Why would Terah take his family there? Well, because it's the second most important place of the worship of the god Nana. That's why he went there. So God is still, of course, in trouble in the sense that he has to extract Abram from this place and from his family. And that's why, of course, Genesis 12 starts the way it does. When God lays down the terms and the conditions that have to be met by Abraham if he is going to become the father of a multitude of nations. So here we've got Abram and his family making their way northwards to Haran. It's a depiction, of course, and you see the obviously very beautiful woman over here. That's clearly Sarai, and of course she's riding on an ass while the men have to do the hard work and walk. So they make their way north. And here is this promise which has in it three primary conditions that need to be met. Let's read these conditions. Verse 1, get thee out of thy country. So there it is, the first condition. That was accomplished in leaving Ur of the Chaldees. The second condition is, and from thy kindred. That was met when Abram and Lot left their family behind in Haran. And the third condition was, and from thy father's house. And that condition was not met until Genesis chapter 13, when Lot left Abram's company and Abram was left alone. He had left his father's house. You know what happens? Immediately that Lot takes his family and heads towards Sodom, Yahweh says to Abram, right, stand up here, look around. For all the land that thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed. You see, Abraham's not promised the land until Genesis 13. Until he's met these three conditions. Christ has promised the land before Abram. In Genesis 12 verse 7 we read, unto thy seed will I give this land. Who's that? That's Christ. But Abram is not promised the land personally until he meets these conditions, and neither will we receive the land unless we meet the conditions. And those conditions are laid down. Get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, from thy father's house. Leave behind the natural. Make a new start in the spiritual. That's what it's all about. Becoming pilgrims and strangers upon the earth and waiting for a better day. That was the whole life of Abraham. So here are the three conditions which of course he ultimately meets. And those conditions laid the basis for the promise that was to come. Now the promise made to Abraham here in Genesis 12 has 7 clauses in it. You can tell this by looking at the word and. And I will make of thee a great nation. And I will bless thee. And make thy name. And so on. And there are 7 of those. And in the life of Abram, he receives 7 promises. There's Genesis 12 verses 1 to 3, Genesis 12 verse 7, Genesis chapter 13, the last few verses, Genesis 15, which is the 4th, Genesis 17, which is the 5th, Genesis 18, which is the 6th, and Genesis 22, which contains the 7th. And of course, all of us are aware that Genesis 22 is stamped all over with 7. 4 times in Genesis 22, Abraham, in preparing to go up to Moriah, when he gets there, when he's got Isaac on the mountain, and when, of course, he takes the ram, 4 times, the record records him as doing 7 things. And then we read that Yahweh says to Abraham, by myself have I sworn. Sworn? Yes, the Hebrew word shabbat, which means to 7 oneself. And so God makes the 7th promise, which is unconditional to Abraham in Genesis 22. So there's this number 7 is all over the promise to Abraham. So little wonder then that the first promise contains 7 clauses. We're basically going to have a look just at one, the first one. Now, when God speaks, he doesn't have preambles like we tend to do. You know, we have prefaces and preambles, and no. He comes straight out with it. And when he makes this first promise, in this first clause, this is the ultimate promise. This is the greatest promise that he's making to Abraham. It is about making of him a great nation. And that's going to be our subject this morning. And you're going to see its relationship to what we've been discussing in terms of Nimrod and the system of apostasy that grew up around him and his father Cush. Now this term, a great nation, the word nation is the word goy or goyim. Goy is the singular, goyim the plural. It means a nation or a people. It's a noun in the masculine. It first occurs in Genesis chapter 10 verse 5 twice. It's rendered there in the AV, Gentiles and nations. Its next 4 occurrences are rendered nations in Genesis 10 verse 20, 31 and in verse 32 twice. The 7th occurrence of this word just happens to be, quite accidentally of course, in Genesis chapter 12 verse 2. I will make of thee a great nation. Now, I want you to just focus on what I'm going to say in the next 2 or 3 minutes. Because you see, we're going to see the pristine structure in the Hebrew language that God uses to record these events. Why would that be the case, do you think? Well, you see, this is about God's pure language. This is about God setting forth pure religion. And it's going to culminate in Zephaniah chapter 3 verse 9. I will return to the peoples a pure language, a pure religion. So that's why the Spirit is so precise here. You notice what he does here. This is the 7th occurrence of this word goy or goyim. I will make of thee a great nation. In the first of 7 clauses, in the first of 7 promises made to Abraham. And indeed, the word great is the Hebrew word gadol. This is also the 7th occurrence in the Old Testament of that word. We go on to the word families. This word families, mishpachah, means a clan, a family, a tribe, or of a kind, hence a people or a nation. Its first occurrence is in Genesis chapter 8 verse 19, rendered kinds. Its next 5 occurrences are rendered families, Genesis 10:5, 18, 20, 31 and 32. The 7th occurrence of that Hebrew word is in Genesis 12 verse 3. In thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Guess what? First of 7 promises has 7 clauses. And this word blessed, barak, just happens to be the 7th occurrence in the Old Testament. Okay? In fact, the 7th occurrence is in Genesis 12 verse 2. And I will bless thee, it renders it. And this one here, just to be perfectly accurate, this word blessed is the 10th occurrence of the word barak. So the 7th is in verse 2, the 10th is in verse 3. Now how come? Why would God do it that way? Well, you see, 10 just happens to be the biblical number for all. And what's this about? In thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Got it? Like I said, it's absolutely pristine. Because God wants us to understand his pure language. This is the preaching of the gospel, isn't it? Paul tells us in Galatians 3 verse 8 that when God made appearance to Abraham and made this promise, he was preaching to him the gospel. That's the statement of faith. This is about the kingdom of God and the name of Jesus Christ. It's all back here. This is the purity of the truth. This is pure religion. And he's working to unwind Nimrod's impure religion, where the tongue is confused and men are all befuddled and confused, don't understand truth. He's plucking a man out of Ur the Chaldees and saying, I'm going to start with you. And by the time I'm finished, everybody's going to have your faith. And I'm going to be all and in all. And that's what he means when he says, I will make of thee a great nation. It can't actually happen until the end of 7,000 years of human history. So this work was begun with Abraham. It was pursued all through the Old Testament era and into the New Testament era. And we know, of course, that the sons of Noah are all called to this same truth in the book of Acts. He says, I will bless all families. All families? Well, they all came from Noah, through Shem, Ham and Japheth. So you come to the book of Acts, guess who? Shem is first. Acts chapter 2 verse 5. And Peter is going to speak to these people. They were dwelling at Jerusalem, Jews, Shemites, devout men out of every nation under heaven. And we know what happened when Peter preached on that day, the day of Pentecost. 3,000 were baptised. In Acts chapter 8 verse 27, Ham is invited in the person of the Ethiopian eunuch. And he arose and went, and behold, a man of Ethiopia, a eunuch of great authority under Candace, queen of the Ethiopians. By the way, Thea says that this word Ethiopians in the New Testament means black. So Ham is the father of the dark races. Okay, so here's the second calling of all the families of the earth. What about the third? Well, Japheth. In Acts chapter 10, verse 1, there was a certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius, a centurion of the band called the Italian band. Yeah, he's a Japhethite. You see, what God is doing is calling a people for the name. Simeon hath declared how God the first did visit the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name. So what had Peter told the Jerusalem conference about his work? Which of course he initially did not want to perform, like Jonah. He was at Joppa, where Jonah was. And God had to give him this vision from heaven of the sheep, the napkin that came down with all these unclean animals and said, rise, kill and eat, Peter. No, I've never done that. He's being told he has to go and preach to Gentiles that the Jews regarded as unclean. He's got to go to the house of Cornelius. And it's just a simple fact of history that God appeared to both Abram and Cornelius to call them out of darkness. They were both given instructions requiring a decision, action and travel. Cornelius had to go to Joppa, had to send men to Joppa to call for Peter to come to his house. Both needed to leave behind their nativity. Both became associated with the name. That name was Shem, Melchizedek and Christ. There was no name given under heaven except his, whereby men might be saved. And Cornelius in his house, Japhethites, received the blessing of dwelling in the tents of Shem. They became members of the house of God, the ecclesia, part of the brotherhood, in their dwelling, like you and I, in the tents of Shem. Incredible, isn't it? So what God began back there with Abram, he's been pursuing right down through history, and he's still at work. And you and I are the evidence of that. He's still calling people out of the nations to be a people for his name. That's the easy stuff. Now we come to the culmination. And we need just to focus for a while. Well, firstly, what I want to do is just to build a picture in your mind of what the apocalypse contains. Now, when you put that chart up, it sort of overwhelms people a bit until they get the idea of it. Now, this chart, as you can see over here on the left-hand side, begins with the return of Christ, the resurrection and the judgment seat. Okay? And that goes on for 10 years. Then you've got a 40-year period after Armageddon. There's your Armageddon line. Okay? 40-year period of divine judgment to establish the kingdom. And then you have, of course, the millennium. So this is the period of the millennium. And then beyond that, you have God being all and in all. So this is the period of the 8th millennium and beyond. Got the structure? Okay. Now what do these black rectangular boxes represent? Well, they represent all the visions of glory in the apocalypse. And as you work from chapter 1, you've got the multitudinous Christ vision. And that vision, of course, covers from the glorification of the bride, which is here at the judgment seat, right through to the end of the millennium. That's what that vision covers in its scope. So you've got a little idea how the chart works. The throne in heaven of Revelation 4 verse 1 to 5:14 covers the time after Armageddon when the throne of David is established right through to the end of the millennium. The vision of Revelation chapter 7 is about the true Israel of God, the 144,000, symbolic number. That's from the time of their glorification through to the end. And so it goes on. Chapter 10, the triumph of the rainbowed angel, is about this period of time. It ends, of course, with the subjugation of the nations. Revelation 14 is a similar period. It's that 40-year period of judgment. Revelation 15 it sees the redeemed on a sea of glass, that is in the tranquility of the kingdom age. Revelation 19 is about the conquest of the nations, and particularly, of course, about the crushing of the system of Nimrod. And then we come down to these three. We've got Revelation chapter 20, which is about the serpent being bound and ultimately released and then finally destroyed. I'm going to focus a bit more on that in a moment. Then you've got this vision. This is Revelation chapter 21, verses 1 to 8, which is the only piece of the apocalypse that takes us beyond the end of the millennium. It opens the curtains on that time beyond the millennium. Revelation 21, verses 1 to 8. And then, of course, we have the final vision, chapter 21, verse 9 to 22, verse 6, which sees the new Jerusalem come down from God out of heaven. That is where the promise to Abraham ends up. We want to talk about that this morning. So we're going to focus on these 3 chapters, the culmination of the divine purpose. And what we're going to find is that what we have in those last 3 chapters of the Bible is the culmination of the 3 great covenants. The 3 great covenants in the Scripture. The first was Genesis 3:15, the promise of a Redeemer and the ultimate destruction of the serpent. The second was the Abrahamic covenant, and the third was the Davidic covenant. And they are seen to be fulfilled in the last 3 chapters of the Bible. Revelation 20 is about the final fulfillment of Genesis 3:15. The old serpent is bound and finally destroyed. Sin and rebellion are completely eradicated. Death is finally abolished. In Revelation 21, the Abrahamic covenant is seen to be fulfilled. The holy city is the Abrahamic city, as we're going to see in a moment. It's finally completed. The one nation, the great nation that God promised Abraham in the very first clause of the very first promise, is finally seen. It's that one nation, Israel, that we spoke about yesterday. It embraces all. And the eternal inheritance given to every member of it, the inheritance of immortality, eternal life, is the ultimate fulfillment of what God was saying to Abraham back in Genesis 12. In Revelation 22, the promises to David are seen to be fulfilled. There is divine authority over all the earth, and David's throne is established forever. And the spiritual house of David, the perfected ecclesia, is seen to be complete. Now, you wouldn't expect it to be otherwise, would you? That if God makes 3 great covenants, you wouldn't expect any other outcome than the last 3 chapters of the Bible will demonstrate their ultimate fulfillment. It's exactly what we have here. So let's just briefly have a look at Revelation chapter 20. You might want to come along to Revelation 20. And we'll see what God is doing here. Now we know this refers to Genesis chapter 3, because we read in verse 2 of Revelation 20, and he laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent. Now this doesn't mean, of course, that the serpent here is 1,000 years old. This means this is the serpent that was back in the garden, the old serpent. The one, of course, who sparked all the trouble that has led to this ultimate outcome. So what we have here is a depiction of what's going to happen to the serpent. Now we know that the millennium, the 1,000-year reign of Christ, is actually fronted and finished by a brief period, a jubilee period. We can establish very clearly that there was a 50-year period at the front, and there's probably a similar 50-year period at the end, called the little season, in Revelation chapter 20 and verse 3. So these 2 periods are at the front and the back of the millennial period. And of course, the result of the end of this first brief period of 50 years will be that the serpent will be bound. That is, flesh will be subdued upon the earth. It will come under the control, the rigid control of Christ and the saints. It's bound for 1,000 years. But then it's unleashed, we find, in Revelation chapter 20 and verse 7 and 8. The old serpent, that is, human nature, is unleashed. It's allowed to do its own thing, because there has to be a testing of those who have lived out their probation during a time of perfect government, time of almost perfection upon earth. They have to be tested as to whether or not they really want the things that God has to offer to them. And of course, ultimately, the serpent will be destroyed. What that really means is that mortality will be abolished from the earth at the end of the millennium. That's what's meant by the end of chapter 20, when it talks about verse 14, and death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. So all mortality is removed. Sin and death are gone. That's the ultimate fulfillment of Genesis 3:15. I will put enmity between the serpent and the woman, between carnal thinking and my thinking. And there's going to be struggles that go on for 7 millennia. until that struggle ends with the abolition of the serpent, total destruction of the serpent. That's what this chapter is about, isn't it? The fulfilment of Genesis chapter 3:15. He's gone, and the earth will rest from war. The conflict between God and the serpent will be over. What about Revelation 21? Well, this is Genesis chapter 12. Have a look at Revelation 21. It begins this way. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first or former heaven and the former earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. Now, by the former heaven and earth, he means the millennial period. So what we have here is the time beyond the millennium. Verses 1 to 8 of Revelation 21, as I said, step us into the 8th millennium. Now we're going to see why this language is used here in a moment. But let me just remind you of what God promised. He said to Abraham, I will make of thee a great nation. What nation did he mean? Well, Israel. Did he mean Israel in the times of David, when they were great? Did he mean Israel in the time of Solomon, when they were great? No, because it didn't last. What did he mean? Well, he meant this. Just as he said in Jeremiah 30 verse 11 and 46 verse 28, though I make a full end of all nations, whither I have scattered thee, yet will I not make a full end of thee. Can I remind you of what he prefigured in the Feast of Tabernacles that we considered yesterday? Over 7 days, 70 bullocks, which represent all nations, were sacrificed. Day 1 began with 13, the number of Nimrod, down to day 7, the number of the Abrahamic promise, a total of 70, representing all nations. The nations will keep the Feast of Tabernacles in the millennium during the 7th day, for that very reason, that they might learn what God is doing. And of course on the 8th day, just one bullock was offered, representing that one nation that will exist after the millennium, the nation of Israel. Now we've done this all yesterday, so it's pretty familiar to us. But this is what Revelation 21 is about. Did you read verse 1? It said there at the end of the verse, and there was no more sea. Sea? What's the sea a symbol of in Scripture? Nations. Isaiah chapter 17 verses 12 and 13. Isaiah 57 verse 20. Revelation 17 verse 15. They all say the same thing. The sea represents nations and peoples and tongues. They're gone. There are no more nations. There's only one left. And that's the one represented by the New Jerusalem that comes down from God out of heaven. And we're going to see that when we consider Revelation 21 very briefly. So here we've got this section which deals with the time beyond the millennium. This new heavens and new earth refers to that period. For the first, the millennial, has now passed away. No sea, no more nations. And what is seen by John is a city adorned as a bride. It is the final, perfected phase of the ecclesia. It's seen now to be in its final form. Now it's pretty obvious, isn't it, what this city represents? Because when you start considering it, it's stamped all over with the number of Israel. Have a look at verse 12 of Revelation 21. It had a great wall, and high, and had 12 gates. And at the gates were 12 angels, and names written thereon, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. You can't mistake that, can you? It's about Israel. So the only nation left on earth at the end of the millennium, when God is all and in all, is the nation of Israel. And the city is dominated by 12 gates, 12 foundations, 12 apostles, 12 stones. And the number 12 occurs 12 times if you take the 144, which occurs in verse 17, as being 12 times 12. So you say 144 is 12 times 12, you count that as 2 12s, the number 12 occurs 12 times. So this city is a corporation of immortal people, the Israel of God in its final manifestation. And it looks like this. It's ludicrous, of course. This can't be a literal city because it's 12,000 furlongs cubed. Now 12,000 furlongs is 2,400 kilometres, or about 1,800 miles. Okay? So it's a pretty big city if it's going to be a literal city. Well, of course it's not, because its wall is only 144 cubits high. So we know what this is about. This is a symbolic city. This is a mystical city. It represents something else. It represents the completion of the Israel of God, the family of Israel, depicted in Revelation chapter 7. 12 is the number of Israel, and to a Hebrew, 1,000 represents a family. So if you've got 144,000, 12 times 12, that's Israel, and 1,000, a family. This is the final, completed, whole family of Israel. It's a perfect cube, as the Most Holy was a perfect cube, which represents immortality. Because of the love of God. In Ephesians chapter 3, the Apostle Paul makes a wonderful statement about that, doesn't he? I'll read it out to you. Ephesians chapter 3, verses 18 to 21. He says that we may be able to comprehend with all saints what is the breadth, the length, and the depth, and the height. He gives 4 dimensions. And they're all the same. It's a perfect cube. It's the most holy he's talking about. And to know the love of Christ, which passeth knowledge, that ye might be filled with all the fullness of God. Now unto him that is able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that worketh in us, unto him be glory in the ecclesia by Christ Jesus, throughout all ages, ages without end. What's Paul talking about? That. He's talking about our calling to the brotherhood, that we might ultimately end up in that. And he reminds us of the love of God through Christ, that is able to do far above whatever we might think possible. So don't let anybody say you can't be there, because that would limit God. If you allow him, he can get you there. You could be part of that final vision. So Jerusalem, which comes down from heaven out of God. For what purpose? Well, have a look at verse 2 of Revelation 21. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride, adorned for her husband. So this is the bride of Christ in its perfected form. Everyone now upon earth will be immortal. Death has passed away. Have a look at verse 4. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death. So the last enemy has been destroyed. Neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain. You got mortality, you have pain. So there's nobody mortal anymore. For the former things are passed away. And he that sat upon the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. In fact, this will be the time when God himself will dwell with men. He can't do that today. Verse 3 tells us that. And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God. Tabernacle? Interesting, isn't it? Tent. The tent of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them and be their God. Guess where those words come from? They're a direct quotation. You know that? Genesis chapter 17, verses 4 to 8. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And what's Genesis 17 about? Abram's name is changed to Abraham, and God says to him, I will make thee a father of a multitude of nations. Interesting. So here we have the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise. Now some of you might be sitting there saying, look, hang on a second. How do you know that this is the Abrahamic promise? Well, let's give me a chance. 12 times in Revelation 21 and 22 the term city occurs. Accident? Don't think so. So what is this city? Well, it's the Abrahamic city. I want you to come back to Hebrews chapter 11 and 12. Hebrews 11. And in Hebrews 11 verse 9 we have Abram, of course, sojourning in a strange land. In verse 10 we read this about him. For he looked for a city, a polis, which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. So when Abraham left Ur the Chaldees and then Haran and made his way towards the land of promise, he was looking for a city. A city? What? A city of concrete and stones like Ur? No. A city of people. A corporation of people. To put it in simple terminology, he's looking for an ecclesia, but a perfect one. Now, they don't exist today, perfect ecclesias. He was looking for a perfect ecclesia. Have a look at verse 16 of Hebrews 11. But now they desire a better country, the word country's not there, that is an heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be surnamed their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. Now what city is Paul referring to? Well, we just need to turn the page to chapter 12 of Hebrews. And we read verses 22 and 23. But ye are come unto Mount Zion, says Paul, to the Hebrews and to us, and unto the city, there it is, the city of the living God. So what city is this? Read on. The heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and ecclesia of firstborns, which are written in heaven, which means that their names are in the book of life, and to God the judge of all, and to the spirits or characters of just men made perfect. So that's the city, brothers and sisters. It's the New Jerusalem. It's the city that Abraham set out to seek. It's the Abrahamic promise fulfilled in a multitude of people drawn from all nations who become the perfected ecclesia, the bride of Christ, the New Jerusalem that comes down from God. It's his work out of heaven. It's not talking about a literal thing coming out of heaven, it's talking about what he's produced on earth by the Abrahamic covenant, by the preaching of the gospel, by the purity of the truth, by people grasping it, by people becoming pilgrims and strangers like Abraham, and waiting for the day when they will inherit in that land, and for the day when God will be perfected and will be all and in all, and there will only be one nation left on the earth, the great nation that God promised to Abraham. I will make of thee a great nation. That's what Genesis 12 verses 1 to 3 is about. And it's all here at the end of our Bibles in Revelation chapter 21. Brother Thomas says, the holy city is styled the New Jerusalem body politic and the Holy Jerusalem association of saints. He further says in Eureka Volume 1, page 115, it is the Yahweh Elohistic municipality. Now why would he call it a municipality? Well, what is a municipality? Well, it's a city, isn't it? But this is not a city of brick and stone and houses. This is a city of people. Now, I'm not sure what happens in North America, but in Australia, you cannot declare yourself to be a city unless you have at least 100,000 inhabitants. So if your town has got 90,000, sorry, you're a town. You've got 100,000 citizens, you can become a city. Well, this city has 144,000. All right, the symbolic number. It is a corporation of people, not brick and mortar. So that's what a city is. It's also called, as Brother Thomas says, as we go on, he says, it is the Yahweh Elohistic municipality symbolised by 144 cubits, each cubit representing 1,000 of the numerical symbol of this holy nation, the Israel of the deity. So you see, city and nation are equivalent terms. They both refer to a corporation of people. That's what Revelation 21 is telling us. So what we have here, brothers and sisters, is a tale of two mystical cities. And they go right back to the first literal city. Enoch built by Cain in defiance of God, rebuilt by Nimrod and called Erech, manifested in Babylon, the mystical city, which represents the great system, Babylon the Great. On the other hand, we have the other mystical city. This is the perfected ecclesia, the finality of the 144,000, the holy nation, the great nation that God promised to Abraham. For God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city, and there it is. It's the bride of Christ in all of her perfection. And so when this is done, the rebellion of Nimrod will have been completely reversed. There will now be just one language upon the earth. Just one. But before I take you back to Zephaniah 3, let me just show you briefly the third covenant fulfilled in Revelation 22. You should have a look at verse 1. Revelation 22. And he showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding out of the throne of God and of the Lamb. What throne's that? What's the throne of chapter 5? Verses 5 to 7, isn't it? What throne's that? The throne of David. Do we know that from this context? Yes, turn the page to verse 16. I, Jesus, have sent mine angel to testify unto you these things in the ecclesias. I am the root and the offspring of David, the bride and the morning star. So the Davidic promise is seen to be fulfilled in Revelation 22. Now, if they were all mixed up, higgledy-piggledy, you might say, well, yeah, that could be right. But the promises were given in that order. Genesis 3:15, Revelation 20. Abrahamic, Revelation 21. Davidic, Revelation 22. So it's not higgledy-piggledy, is it? It's not jumbled. It's in the exact order that God made those covenants. It is seen to be fulfilled at the end of the millennium. No accident about that. And of course, in this matter of the Abrahamic promise, in the unwinding of Nimrod's apostasy, we have the fulfillment in Revelation chapter 21. Now, I want you to come back to Zephaniah chapter 3. I'm going to conclude on this point because this really is a summary of all that we've discussed over the course of the last 2 days. Zephaniah chapter 3. Because when God unwinds the rebellion of Nimrod, there will be one pure Safar. You see there in verse 9 of Zephaniah chapter 3 it says, for then will I turn, the word there means to return. Then will I return to the peoples, plural, a pure language. Now that word language is the Hebrew word Safar. Guess where its first occurrence is in the Bible? Oh, Genesis 11 verse 1. Where else? They were all of one lip. Genesis 11 verse 1. And that's what was corrupted by Nimrod. They had originally God's lip. What was that? Pure Hebrew, biblical Hebrew. What does God use Hebrew for? To talk about the weather or the time of day? No. Every time God opens his mouth, he talks about religion. He talks about his purpose. That's the only reason he opens his mouth. That's why Christ could say to the tempter, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. He will not tell you the temperature of the day, whether it's going to snow. He's only interested in one thing, religion. Pure tongue. And that's what he's going to restore to people. A pure lip. I will return to the peoples. A pure language, of course. Literally, that will be biblical Hebrew, the divine tongue. But it's not just a language. It's a way of speaking. It's a religion. A pure religion. That's what he means. He's going to unwind Nimrod's apostasy. All nations will be incorporated into one, as we saw in Revelation chapter 21. All families of the earth will be blessed in Abraham and his seed. There will be one city, a great nation, which remains, in which all are immortal. It's the perfected bride of Christ. Sin and death will be abolished, and God will dwell with men, as we saw in Revelation 21 verse 3. And this phrase, these words, "We will rebel," the meaning of the name of Nimrod, will never be heard on earth again. Now, how will that all begin? Well, it's begun, of course, back with Abraham. But tomorrow, and I mean by that when Christ comes to collect us and to make us part of that bride, that's when our role in all of this begins. Because we're going to be involved in fulfilling this passage. Zephaniah chapter 3 verse 8. Now this is one of the most beautiful verses in the whole of the Bible. You know why? Let me tell you why. Let's just read the verse first of all. One sentence it is, verse 8. It's a long sentence. "Therefore wait ye upon me, saith Yahweh, until that day, until the day that I rise up to the prey." To the prey. Who was the first man to rise up to the prey and to make himself a god in the eyes of his people? Nimrod. You know, he's mentioned 3 times, at least his father's mentioned 3 times in Zephaniah. 3 times you find the word Cush, once in each chapter of this prophecy. Cush, the father of Nimrod. And Yahweh says, "Wait upon me until the day that I rise up to the prey. For my determination is to gather the nations, that I may assemble the kingdoms." What was the effect of Nimrod's work? Scattering the nations, wasn't it? Dispersing the nations. What's God saying? I'm going to assemble them and to gather them. For what purpose? To pour upon them mine indignation and all my fierce anger. For all the earth shall be devoured with the fire of my jealousy. Why is God jealous, do you think? Because Nimrod stole his authority. Nimrod displaced him in the eyes of men. Nimrod's the Antichrist, as his successors have been the Antichrist, has stolen God's authority. That's why he's jealous. Did you know that Zephaniah 3 verse 8 is the only verse in the Old Testament that has in it every single letter of the Hebrew alphabet, including the 5 final letters? Now the Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters in it. And they have what they call 5 final letters, which are used on the end of words, okay? Which is a total of 27. Now, I ask you a question. Give me a sentence in English that uses every letter of the English alphabet. I can. Didn't you learn this at school? The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. Who cares? What does that mean? Well, that's nonsensical, isn't it? Not this verse. This verse has every letter of the Hebrew alphabet, including the 5 finals. 27 in total. Think about that. How do you get 27? Well, 3 times 9. 3 is the number of fruit or result, and 9 is the number of judgment and finality. If you use adding up, 2 numbers that can be added up to make 27, what would they be, do you think? How about 13 and 14 next to each other? 13, the number of rebellion. 14, the number of the certainty of covenant. So God puts every letter of his tongue, his lip, his language into that one verse. And then he says this in verse 9. Then do I turn unto peoples a pure lip, to call all of them by the name of Yahweh. He's going to make all men called by the name Yahweh. To serve him with 1 shekel, one shoulder. Incredible, isn't it? He's unwound Nimrod's apostasy and returns to the people a pure religion. What a wonderful verse that is. Speaks eloquently of what God has done as he called Abram out of Ur the Chaldees and began the process in him, a process he's still using in us to unwind the apostasy and the rebellion.